It even took place before I was born. Probably took place when either your grandparents or great-grandparents were your age. It's a love story. Does anyone like love stories? One. Anyone else? And it's a war story. Does anyone like war stories? All right. Sometimes they go hand in hand, the love and the war thing, right?
I love finding Anthony.
Oh, you love Anthony. Well, we'll talk about that later. It's not funny, everyone, just in case if you didn't hear that.
Well, we were fighting for real. It wasn't a story.
Okay. Let me tell you about another fight. So once there was a city that was named after Jesus' best friend. It was kind of like St. Peter's City, but they called it St. Petersburg. And it's far away from here. And like I said, it was when your grandparents or your great-grandparents were your age. We're not going to talk now, okay? Because we have a meeting afterwards, and I got to keep things moving today. So, are the teachers? Yes, you're going to go play today. And learn. So, in the city of St. Petersburg, named after Jesus' friend, there was an army that didn't like them, and they came and they surrounded the whole city. And that meant no food could get into the city, and it's a siege, exactly. And they couldn't go out to get food, so they shared the food they had. If they were sick, there was an army around them, and they couldn't go out to get medicine if they ran out. And no medicine could come to them because it was a siege. So they shared what medicine they had. And St. Petersburg is a place that's very cold. And in this time, they warmed themselves with either coal or wood. And almost all the wood was gone in this very cold city. And people were worried it would be so cold they might not live. It was that cold. And they couldn't go out of the city to get wood. And they'd used up a bunch of the wood they had, and they shared when they could, but it was running out. And so the people of faith that were Lutherans in that city held a meeting in their church, and they said, what can we do? Our neighbors and our families are cold. This is a true story. I'm not making this one up. And they said, well, maybe people could come to the church. And their property guy said, our church is almost out of firewood too. What can we do? And it was real quiet. I'll be back in 1 second. It was real quiet, but there were some kids in the church. This is how I imagine it. I don't have this part for true, and the kids were getting bored with this meeting, and they did this on the chair they were sitting on. They knocked. Can you go over by there and knock on another one? Because when one child saw it, you go get the second one. You'll get a go. Yep, when one saw it, another one did. Find a pew and knock on it, Violet. And finally, everyone was knocking. Okay, you can come sit down again. All the kids were knocking. And one of the oldest kids said, we're sitting on wood. And we're sitting in wood. And you might not believe it, but this is really what happened. The people loved their building a lot. They had cared for it for a long time. They'd baptized their children in it for generations. But they knew their families were cold, and they knew their neighbors were cold. And so board by board, they took apart their lovely church and shared it with their neighbors so that they could be warm during the siege. The siege. That's a new word you can use. All right? Isn't that amazing? They took something that was their very most precious thing in their life of faith, and they said, Jesus and loving our neighbor is more important. And so we're going to share it with others. Maybe they knew a story that I knew, a poem that I knew when I was a kid. Do you know this one? Where you put your hands like this? You say, here's the church. And you say, here's the steeple. You know what a steeple is?
Yep.
What?
A steeple is when somebody ran out of wood, they start shooting some other people so they can get some more wood.
Oh, well, that's kind of what it is. It's the part of the church that's the highest part. Often it's pointy. In our church, it's kind of square. And so the poem goes, here's the church, here's the steeple, but if you open it up, you see all the people. And so that church wanted to be friends of Jesus, like the city they had that was named Peter, Jesus' best friend city. And so they did a very hard thing because they wanted to love like Jesus. Kind of an amazing story, hey? Let's say a prayer. Holy Jesus, sometimes we feel like we're under siege. Like we don't have the resources we need. We don't have what we need to get through the next day. Help us to look around us and see those who need our help and admit it when we need help and share what we have so that we might be filled with the warmth of the love of Jesus. In your name we pray. Amen. Now we have a couple of Sunday school teachers, a couple of one Sunday school teachers here, and anyone who would like to go with them, whether they came up for the children's sermon or if they would like to go with her and you didn't, you're welcome to do that, and you'll come back right before communion. So now you can go off with Kelsey. might have noticed that the choir anthem arose at the time of 9/11. I'm going to be talking about catastrophes that happened in the life of Israel, and maybe there's no other national example that comes close to the emotional desperation that people experienced in the time of Israel that I'll talk about as 9/11 was here, although many of us have personal examples of devastation that maybe help us tap into the emotions that I'll be describing. The Holy Gospel is from St. Luke, the 21st chapter. When some were speaking about the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and gifts dedicated to God, Jesus said, "As for these things you see, the days will come when not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down." They asked him, "Teacher, when will this be, and what will be the sign that this is about to take place?" And he said to them, "Beware that you are not led astray. For many will come in my name and say, 'I am,' and the time is near. Do not go after them. When you hear of wars and insurrections, do not be terrified, for these things must take place first, but the end will not follow immediately." Then he said to them, "Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes, and in various places famines and plagues. There will be dreadful portents and great signs in the heaven. But before all this occurs, they will arrest you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors because of me. This will give you an opportunity to testify. So make up your minds not to prepare your defense in advance, for I will give you your words, and a wisdom that none of your opponents will be able to withstand or contradict. You will even be betrayed by parents and brothers and relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. You will be hated by all because of my name, but not a hair on your head will perish. By your endurance, you will gain your souls." The Gospel of the Lord. Please be seated. Every so often in the life of the people of God, something happens that disrupts everything. For the people of Israel, the people of God that Jesus was a part of, just to remind you of that, the horrible, unthinkable thing happened twice, the same thing, when the most powerful nations of this day and that, two different times, came into Jerusalem and destroyed what was most precious to them. That precious thing was the temple, the dwelling place of God. The temple was much more than any church, because there was only one in Israel, because there was only one God. Israel held God's chosen people, the geographic space of Israel. Within the geography of Israel's religious imagination, Jerusalem was the center of the whole nation. Within Jerusalem, the temple was central, and the temple was built upon a human construct, a foundation of sorts, that's called the Temple Mount. That which sat on the Temple Mount was God's dwelling place. And try not to think of that as a metaphor. For them, that's what it was. If you wanted to know where God's house was, this is the address you showed up at. You can see a picture here, a contemporary picture of what's left. First of all, you can see how huge the stones are. Look at the little ants that are gathered at the feet of it. And what you see, this big wall, is the foundation. It's not the temple, it's the foundation on which the temple was built. The west wall of the temple. So this is the human-made structure that they built the temple upon, because all the stones of the temple were cast down. Within the temple was the Holy of Holies, a place so holy that God was the only permanent resident, and one other person every year was randomly chosen to get to spend some time with God on behalf of the people, right there in the Holy of Holies. Those of you who can think in terms of dimensions, entertain this. The stones that are referred to as beautiful in this text were huge. The largest that our archaeologists have been able to document was, listen, single stone, 44.6 feet long, 11 feet tall, 16 and a half feet wide, a single stone, moved without caterpillar machinery, right? Weighed 600 tons about. Between the belief that the temple was God's unique dwelling place and the sheer weight of the stones, I guess we cannot fault them for believing that it would be permanent, eternal, always there, for believing that through the sacrifices that were offered there, God maintained God's relationship with the people. How could they imagine that it was otherwise? But twice in its history, about 700 years apart, a superpower of the day came in and destroyed God's dwelling place. Destroyed God's dwelling place. Imagine what that did for the people's faith. First, it was the Babylonians who came in and flattened it, took the people into exile. People built it up again over many years. And then, shortly, 30 years after the death of Jesus, the Romans came in and destroyed it again. So that prophecy that Jesus says, not one stone will be left upon a stone, not one 600-ton stone will be left upon a stone, was fulfilled. When the powerful came and utterly destroyed God's house, the center of their whole faith life, the people found themselves asking what this said about God. Was God also just a concept that we built up, like the temple? If Babylon and Rome, with their gods, can destroy our God's house, what does that say about our God? You understand how this would shake your faith? For a good length of time, they just simply were shattered, as many of us are when tragedy visits our homes. They just wept for a stretch of time. In fact, the picture on the bulletin is what remains of the temple, as I explained. They gather, all those people gathering. I was there almost a year ago to the date. All these people gather at the west wall because it's the closest they can get to the Holy of Holies, where God's presence once dwelled. So above all their tiny little heads, where the wall ends, that's where the Holy of Holies structure would have been put. They stand as close as they can to the place where God once dwelled so they can pray. They pray to a God who knows what loss is intimately. Since God's own dream house was shattered, as surely as their lives had been shattered when they lost their homeland. They prayed to a God who experienced eviction at the hands of the powerful nations of the world, just as God's people had. They prayed to a fellow sufferer, God, who understood their plight. Yet God promises them that neither Babylon nor Rome would have the final word. Friends, the destruction of the temple changed everything for them. Their faith questions were no longer centered on issues of the temple, its functions, and its functionaries. They had to figure out what faith looks like now that those massive stones no longer lay one upon another. Out of this profound loss, both times that they suffered, They found a new way forward to endure in the faith. Just as that choir anthem talked about moving forward after impossible times. They did that by asking what God was up to in the big, broad world beyond the rubble that lay before them. What to do and what to be now, that our most trusted place for finding God no longer existed. After the first time the temple was destroyed, it's the 7th century BC, if you're a nerd and want to know that, under the Babylonians, what they did was they finally wrote down major parts of what we call the Old Testament. If the temple hadn't been destroyed, we might not have something like half to 2/3 of the scriptures that we read week after week in this place looking for hope. Out of a crisis of major proportions, they found a way forward in the stories of their God. They told them again and again so they would recognize God's presence when it moved around them in the world out there, since there no longer was a world in here for them to visit. The second time, Jesus predicts around 33 AD. He didn't know that was the date yet because it wasn't called that yet, but when Jesus predicted that the temple would be destroyed a second time, and when it was fulfilled, and once again permanence was lost for the faith community, the followers of Jesus only then picked up a pen and wrote down the story of Jesus' life that we know as the Gospel of Mark. And shortly after, still trying to make sense of the destruction of the temple, they wrote down 2 more Gospels, and then another 10 years, a third one, trying to make sense of how God is present now that that which we had counted on was lost. They gathered all the stories of what God had done and dwelled in those stories so that they might recognize God's presence in the world when the Spirit of God moved through their neighborhood, their new neighborhood, in new ways. Some contemporary Christians who think about such things are suggesting that there's much we could learn from the destruction of the temple and the faith that followed it. They think, I could say we think, we need to shift our questions. It's a hard shift, but from church structure questions to God questions. Instead of asking how we can ensure the permanence of church buildings and get people into them on Sunday mornings, they suggest we need to dwell deeply in God's stories again. We need to pray to the God who understands loss personally and deeply. We need to pray to the God who wept and wept and wept again over lost dreams. And we need to ask how the stories that we have inherited help us to see God and what God is up to beyond our big and beautiful buildings, and they are beautiful. So don't get me wrong, I love it when people come here, and I love how well we take care of this. But we need to ask where God is active in the world when the things we thought would always hold God in place do not seem to be doing that for others as they did for us. We need to ask those who are not seated in church with us today, maybe they're right across the street. Ask them, where have you experienced God in your lives? And we need to not assume that they haven't experienced God. We need to listen expectantly about what they know that we don't see. Do not get me wrong, this is a major shift in our thinking. It's not the way we've asked questions for the last, 2,000 years. We probably won't find the required adjustments that such questions ask of us any more pleasurable than the people of Israel did when their world was turned around on them. But God is not willing to be confined within 4 walls, even 4 beautiful walls. God is out and about in the world, active, mending what is broken, rescuing what can be rescued, creating hope where hope has come crashing down. And this is good news for us, because even those of us who spend many, 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 many hours in this place each week spend even more hours outside of this place each week. May we have the courage to trust that God knows what God is up to, and God is up to something, and that God's grace will be renewed in this new day. Where God is found may look different than it did when we were children. But since the same divine hands and the same divine voice are crafting our new life together, it will definitely be a gift worth cherishing. Amen.